At Polaris Outpost, located 80 miles north of anywhere rational human beings should be, sound is a luxury. There is only the ceaseless screaming wind of the high Arctic winter and the hum of the geothermal generator that keeps us from freezing solid. When you hear something else, it's usually bad news. A cracking glacier means unstable ice. A sputtering engine means a death sentence. But at 03 hours, during the pitch-black heart of the polar night, we heard something that defied all logic. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't meteorological. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was knocking on the reinforced external blast door of Sector C, the heavy vehicle maintenance bay. I was awake, staring at climate data on my tablet in the mess hall. Lars, our mechanic and the only other soul on station, was asleep in his bunk. The sound froze the blood in my veins. We were supposed to be the only expedition within 500 square miles. A lost traveler? Impossible in this weather. I scrambled to the security console, my breath clouding in the chilly air of the corridor. I pulled up the external infrared camera feed for Sector C. The screen flickered to life in shades of grey and thermal white. I didn't see a human shape. My brain refused to process the image for a solid 5 seconds. Standing on its hind legs, its massive paws pressing against the steel door, was a fully grown polar bear. It wasn't attacking the door. It wasn't trying to break in. It was leaning against it, its posture radiating sheer, desperate exhaustion. Then it turned its massive head and looked directly into the camera lens. Its eyes, even through the grainy black and white feed, held a terrifying intelligence and a plea so profound it made my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong with this animal. My hand hovered over the general alarm button, trembling. Polaris protocol was crystal clear. In the event of a Class 5 Predator encounter near the perimeter, initiate lockdown and prepare deterrence. We had rubber bullets, flashbangs, and high-decibel sonic cannons, but you don't use sonic cannons on an animal that knocks. Instead, I sprinted down the metal corridor to Lars's quarters. I didn't bother knocking. I slammed the door open. Lars, Sector C, now. Lars was awake instantly, swinging his legs out of the bunk. He was a bear of a man himself, a cynical mechanic who had spent 20 winters in the high north. He grabbed a thermal flare gun from his wall rack before he even put his boots on. Breach? Is it the generator? Just come to the console, I said, my voice tight. When we reached the screens, the bear was still there. She had slumped down into a sitting position, her massive back resting against the reinforced steel door. The snow around her was undisturbed. She hadn't been pacing or charging. Lars squinted at the grainy infrared image, his jaw tightening. That's not right, he rumbled. She's too fat for this time of year, unless... He leaned closer to the screen. Eleanor, look at her midsection. How low she's carrying. I saw it then. She wasn't just large, she was immensely, heavily pregnant. Every few seconds a tremor seemed to ripple through her massive frame, and she would throw her head back, opening her mouth in a silent pant that fogged the camera lens. She's in labor, I whispered, the realization hitting me with physical force. She came here for warmth, Lars muttered, lowering the flare gun. The geothermal vents near the maintenance bay made that steel door the warmest surface for 50 miles. We stood paralyzed in the warm safety of the control room. Outside, separated by 6 inches of steel, the world's deadliest land predator was alone in the dark, freezing to death while trying to bring new life into the void. Protocol said let nature take its course. Humanity said something else entirely. The temperature gauge on the external wall read 42 below zero. With the wind chills screaming off the ice sheet, it was cold enough to snap exposed metal. She's not going to make it, Lars, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We had been watching the screen for 20 minutes. The bear's movements had slowed. The rhythmic thumping against the door had ceased, replaced by a low, agonizing slide as she adjusted her weight. A dark stain, visible even on the thermal feed as a patch of intense heat, was spreading on the snow beneath her hips. It's a breach, Lars said, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. He was leaning so close to the monitor, his nose almost touched the glass. Or she's too exhausted to push. Either way, if she stays out there, the frostbite will take the cubs before they even hit the ground. "We can't go out there," I said, reciting the handbook even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "Interaction with wildlife is strictly prohibited. If we step out, she'll see us as a threat. She'll burn her last ounce of energy attacking us." Lars turned to me. The blue light of the monitors reflected in his eyes, making him look older, tired. "I didn't say we go out there, Elena. I said she can't stay there." He pointed to the schematic of Sector C on the secondary screen. The maintenance bay was designed like a submarine airlock. There was the massive outer blast door, a cavernous vehicle vestibule used for de-icing snowmobiles, and then the inner pressure door that led to the station proper. "The vestibule isn't heated," Lars said, tracing the line of the room. "But it's windproof, it's dry, and the floor is grated rubber, not ice. You want to invite an 800-pound killing machine inside the perimeter." "I want to open the outer door," Lars corrected. "Just the outer one. We keep the inner seal locked. We give her shelter. That's it." It was insanity. If the hydraulics on the outer door froze in the open position, a real possibility in this storm, we would be exposing the station's outer shell to the elements. If the bear decided to tear at the inner door, she could breach the station. I looked back at the camera feed. The bear had stopped moving. Her head was bowed low, her nose buried in the snow, the universal posture of an animal preparing to die. She had come to the only source of heat in the wasteland, knocking on the door of the species that had destroyed her habitat, asking for a truce. I reached over the console. My finger hovered over the command sequence, B-Door XT cycle. "If the hydraulics fail," I warned, looking at Lars. "I'll fix them," he said, gripping his wrench. "Open it." I punched the command. Through the floorboards, we felt the deep mechanical groan of the heavy gears engaging. On the screen, the snowdrift at the base of the door cracked. The massive steel slab began to rise inch by agonizing inch, fighting the ice that had crusted over the hinges. The bear jerked her head up. For a second, I thought she would bolt. The noise of the gears was deafening in the silence. But she didn't run. She watched the gap widen, sensing the pocket of still dead air inside. The door stopped halfway up. Jammed or fully open, it didn't matter. It was enough. The bear dragged herself up. She didn't walk, she shambled. She pulled her massive bulk over the threshold, into the shadows of the maintenance vestibule, leaving a trail of blood on the white snow outside. As soon as her hind legs cleared the sensor, I hit the close command. The door groaned again, slamming shut and sealing the storm outside. She was inside. The silence in the maintenance vestibule was heavy, broken only by the sound of heavy, labored breathing, echoing through the thick, reinforced glass of the inner viewing port. Lars and I stood in the corridor, our faces pressed against the cold glass. The vestibule was dark, illuminated only by the faint, red emergency strobe that pulsed near the ceiling. In that intermittent crimson light, she looked less like an animal and more like a fallen mountain. She had dragged herself into the corner nearest to us, right up against the inner door. She knew. She could sense the heat leaking through the metal of the station's hull. "She's freezing," Lars whispered, though the glass was soundproof. "The vestibule is out of the wind, but it's still 10 below zero in there." Without a word, Lars turned and ran down the hallway. I heard him banging around in the utility closet. He came back dragging 2 industrial space heaters and a heavy extension cord. He plugged them into the hallway outlets and aimed them directly at the steel door separating us from the bear. "Conduction," he grunted, sweating now. "If we heat this side of the steel enough, it'll radiate through. It won't be a sauna, but it might raise the ambient temp in her corner by a few degrees." It was a desperate engineer's solution, but it was all we had. For the next hour, we didn't move. The bear, who I had silently named Aurora, was in the throes of the final push. Her pain was visible in the way her claws scraped uselessly against the rubber floor mats, shredding them like paper. She let out a roar that vibrated the glass against my forehead, a sound of raw, primitive power that made my knees weak. Then, silence. Aurora curled into a tight ball, burying her nose into her flank. "Did we lose her?" I asked, my voice trembling. Lars shook his head, pointing a thick finger at the glass. "Look there." A tiny movement, a small, wet, dark shape, no bigger than a stick of butter, was wriggling against the massive expanse of white fur. Then a sound came through the glass, a sound so high-pitched and fragile it shouldn't have existed in this frozen hellscape. A squeak, then another. Aurora lifted her massive head. The exhaustion in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce golden intensity. She began to lick the tiny creature, her tongue rough and rhythmic, cleaning the afterbirth and stimulating its circulation. "Two," Lars breathed. "There's a second one." Another tiny form slid into the world. 2 cubs, born on the floor of a human garage at the edge of the world. Aurora used her massive paws, instruments capable of crushing a seal's skull, to gently scoop the 2 blind, hairless mites into the warmest pocket of her fur, right against her skin. She looked up, directly at the viewing port, directly at us. She didn't roar. She didn't charge. She let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound bears make to their young. It was a sound of contentment, a sound of peace. The truce held for 48 hours. For 2 days, the maintenance vestibule became a nursery. The storm raged outside, burying the station in 10-foot drifts. But inside Sector C, a strange, rhythmic quiet had settled. We watched in shifts. When I slept, Lars sat by the glass with a thermos of coffee. When Lars slept, I watched Aurora nurse the 2 impossible small scraps of life she had brought into our world. But by the 3rd morning, the atmosphere shifted. I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not the desperate, weak scratching of a dying animal, but the sharp, testing screech of hardened keratin against steel. I ran to the viewing port. Aurora was up. She was pacing the small confines of the vestibule, her head swinging low, her tongue flicking in and out, tasting the air. She looked at the inner door, the one separating us from her, with a new kind of intensity. "She's hungry," Lars said, coming up behind me. He looked haggard, his eyes dark circles. "She's burning something like 20,000 calories a day nursing those twins. She's tapped out her fat reserves. If she doesn't eat soon, biology is going to take over." "Biology?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "She'll eat the cubs," Lars said bluntly. "Or she'll tear through this bulkhead to eat us. We have to feed her. We don't have seal blubber, Lars. We have freeze-dried spaghetti and powdered eggs." "We have the emergency stash," Lars corrected. He turned and headed for the galley. "The deep freeze, the VIP steaks, the salmon fillets for the visiting dignitaries. All of it." It was madness. We were raiding the station's 6-month reserve of protein. But 10 minutes later, we were back at the vestibule with a plastic crate filled with frozen raw salmon, beef sides and blocks of lard. The problem was delivery. We couldn't open the inner door. She would be on us before we could blink. We couldn't open the outer door. The wind was still howling and the cold would kill the cubs instantly. "The tool drawer," Lars said, pointing to a small, heavy-duty sliding mechanism built into the wall. It was designed to pass heavy wrenches and parts between the clean room and the maintenance bay without breaking the air seal. It was a steel box, 12 inches by 12 inches. "It's too small," I argued, "and if she grabs it while it's open—" "We chop the meat," Lars said, pulling out a cleaver he'd brought from the kitchen. For the next hour, the corridor looked like a butcher shop. We hacked the frozen salmon and beef into bricks. The smell of raw meat permeated the air. Inside the vestibule, Aurora went still. Her nose twitched. She moved to the wall right next to the tool drawer. She could smell it. She let out a huff, her massive paw slamming against the metal plate. Bang! "She's impatient," Lars muttered. He loaded the drawer with 5 pounds of salmon. "Okay, stand back. If she pulls on this mechanism, the gears might strip." Lars turned the crank. The drawer slid outward into the vestibule. Through the glass, I watched Aurora. She didn't pounce. She approached the extending metal box with terrifying speed. She didn't sniff it. She inhaled the contents. 1 bite. 5 pounds of fish gone. She looked at the empty drawer, then looked through the glass at Lars. She let out a low growl and slapped the drawer with her paw, rattling the mechanism in the wall. "More," I said, grabbing a slab of beef. "Keep it coming." We worked in a frenzy. Load, crank, eat, return. Load, crank, eat, return. We fed her 50 pounds of meat in 20 minutes. It was a conveyor belt of survival. As the last block of lard disappeared down her throat, Aurora stopped. She licked her chops, the blood of the beef staining her white muzzle. She looked at the drawer, then at us. The manic energy faded from her eyes. The predator retreated and the mother returned. She turned her massive back to us, lumbered over to the corner where the cubs were mewling, and collapsed into a heap of satisfied fur. "We just fed her 3 months of our Sunday dinners," Lars sighed, leaning against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Worth it," I whispered, watching the cubs crawl back onto their mother. "Yeah," Lars grunted, a small smile cracking his beard. "Worth it." "But the storm is breaking, Elena. The wind has dropped. Tomorrow we have to open the big door." The fourth morning brought the blue hour, that brief magical twilight when the sun threatens to rise over the curve of the earth. The screaming wind had vanished, replaced by a stillness so profound it rang in our ears. Lars and I stood at the console in the control room. We didn't speak. We knew what had to be done. The truce was over. The wild was calling. I pressed the command sequence. B-door X'd open. The hydraulics whined, sounding violent in the quiet air. The massive outer blast door began to lift, revealing a wedge of blinding white snow and a sky painted in impossible shades of indigo and violet. The temperature in the vestibule plummeted instantly. Aurora stood up. She shook her massive coat, sending a cloud of dust motes dancing in the cold, incoming light. She nudged the 2 cubs who were stumbling around on legs that looked like wet noodles, blinking against the brightness. She stepped toward the opening. The smell of the sea ice, miles away but potent, hit her nose. She took a step onto the snow. Then she stopped. For a heartbeat, I thought she would turn back. I thought she would decide that the warmth of the garage was better than the frozen void. But she turned her head. She looked through the thick inner glass one last time. There was no aggression in her posture. Her ears were forward. It wasn't a thank you. Nature doesn't deal in gratitude. It was an acknowledgement. We were part of her pack for 3 days. We were the strange, hairless apes that brought the salmon. Then she chuffed a sharp, commanding sound to her cubs and stepped out onto the ice. The cubs tumbled after her, disappearing into the white expanse. We watched until they were just 3 black dots moving toward the horizon. "Close it," Lars whispered, his voice thick. I hit the button. The door sealed with a heavy thud. The vestibule was empty, marked only by the shredded rubber mats and the stains of birth and survival. We were 80 miles from civilization, alone in the dark again. But looking at that empty room, I knew we would never truly be alone. We had touched the wild, and it had let us live.